Are we ready? Hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie Fidel. I have the privilege of serving as the MAB board president. And for those of you who don't know, MAB has three divisions: the Massachusetts Association for the Blind and Visually Impaired, MAB-V, Adult Disability Services, and the Ivy Street School. So thank you for coming out in this weather and joining us for Ivy Street, Suzanne, and John Pratt lecture series. Welcome to our guests at WBUR CitySpace in Boston and those of you on Zoom. I'd like to acknowledge James, Betsy, and Carter Pratt, who have joined us here tonight at CitySpace. I'd like to start by orienting, oh yes, sorry about that. Paying attention to my script here. I'd like to start by orienting everyone to our Spaces tonight's program and how you can actively participate. Darlene DeVita is our photographer, and by request, Darlene is not using flash photography. Thank you for following her lead. CitySpace staff are filming and recording the program. One camera will be focused on the stage or audience. The other camera will film our interpreters, certified deaf interpreters, Jennifer Alleman and Alicia McClurkin, and American Sign Language interpreters, Darlene Quoto and Jason Schwartz, and apologies if I mispronounce your names. Certified deaf interpreters are deaf or hard of hearing. They have specialized training and certification in nonverbal forms of communication, including ASL. ASL interpreting is real-time translation between American Sign Language and another language, typically English, to support communication. Two people are supporting our guests on Zoom. Stephanie Farrell is our CART interpreter. CART is Communication Access Real-Time Translation, or subtitles for live discussions. Amanda Trombley from MAB is supporting the Zoom webinar. During the Q&A session, we'll invite guests in the room to raise their hands and Zoom guests to use the chat to ask questions. Amanda will raise her hand and read aloud questions asked through Zoom. Behind me, in the back of the room, left-hand side, there's a door leading to two accessible restrooms. Doors leading to the lobby are on the right side of the room. If you need assistance at any time, please raise your hand and a staff member will volunteer to help you. Now here's an overview of tonight's program. James Pratt will deliver a tribute to his parents, Suzanne and John Pratt. Executive Director Brooke Howard will discuss Ivy Street and the Suzanne and John Pratt lecture series. Brooke and Kate Garrity will present Ivy Street's 2024 Suzanne and John Pratt Teaching Fellowship Award. Ivy Street School student Aidan Falk will introduce our Pratt lecturer, Lydia X.Z. Brown. Lydia will present on disability justice and forming communities of practice, followed by Q&A. I'll wrap up the program. Then please join us for coffee, tea, and dessert in the lobby. And now it's my pleasure to welcome James Pratt to share a tribute to his parents, Suzanne and John Pratt. Thank you.
Before I begin, I just want to extend a special thanks to Barbara Salisbury for her tireless leadership and commitment. I'm sure there are going to be plenty of opportunities to celebrate her contributions, but on behalf of my sister and the entire extended John Pratt family, we want to extend our thanks and our congratulations. So as always, it's an honor to be here. This is the second time I've had the opportunity to speak. My sister and I think my children and my niece, and I don't think Gray's spoken yet, but we'll have to get him up here, have had opportunities to share observations about my father. But today I want to spend a little bit more time to talk about my mother. We made the decision a couple years ago to further endow the lecture series with a contribution from my mother. And at the time, it was known as the John Pratt Memorial Lecture. And it seemed a bit odd to call it the John and Suzanne Pratt Memorial Lecture when my mom was still alive and with us. So you can see now it's just the Suzanne and John Pratt Lecture Series. It was important to my mother. This lecture series was always important to her. She gave a lot of her, not just money, but time and effort to being here, to helping make this happen. She wanted to be part of knowing who the speakers would be and all of those things. However, as many of you know, she has been beset by early onset dementia, and she's unable to attend this series anymore. And so while we lost our father to cancer a dozen years ago, we're in the process of losing my mother now. To be clear, she still takes great joy from music and loves to dance. And while she may not know exactly how we're related to her, she will alternatively introduce me as her father or her husband, my father. She knows that we are part of her family, and she knows that she is loved. My mother's memory was already beginning to fray when she made the decision to help endow the lecture series. And had it been any other charity, I, as her financial caretaker, might have been inclined to question my mother's decision. However, I'd seen firsthand over the years how important the Ivy Street School and the speaker series has been and is to my mother. And she loves hearing the speakers, celebrating student successes, and mingling with old friends and colleagues. And the mission is a continuation of her own life's work as a social worker helping others. In short, it gave her purpose. So knowing that she might not be able to directly participate in the work for much longer, my sister and I supported her wish to endow the lecture on the condition that her name was added, and that was our condition, not hers. With that in mind, tonight takes on even greater significance for me and my family as an opportunity to continue to lean in to this purpose that my mother had. So even though she cannot be here tonight, I take great solace that this lecture series continues to fulfill her vision and purpose. And so thank you once again for allowing our family to participate in this terrific event in support of this wonderful institution. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Brooke Howard. I am the Executive Director of Ivy Street, and I am thrilled to see all of you here tonight for such a special event. Ivy Street serves neurodiverse adolescents and young adults through our 3 programs. We have the Ivy Street School, which is what most people are most familiar with. That's a year-round residential and day school just around the corner. We have Skills for Life, which is our community-based program that supports young adults in their homes and in their communities through direct support for skill development, community engagement, and self-determination skills. And we have Community for Life, which is our smallest and newest program. We recently opened a supported apartment for 22 to 26-year-olds, and we have an alumni mentor program, which is launching this spring, summer. At Ivy Street, we are deeply grateful for the continued opportunities to collaborate with so many community and academic partners. It was really nice to see so many people here in the reception from so many different kind of parts of our world. We have people from our state agencies, people from academic institutions, people from advocacy groups. We have families and individuals who we've worked with over the years. So it's really special to see everybody come together, and for that, we're very grateful. These relationships provide us with a vehicle to share experiences, learn together, and evaluate our approach to ensure that our work remains aligned not only with our values, but also with current practice and research. It is our commitment to these partnerships and outcomes that makes the Pratt Lecture Series so important to us. The Suzanne and John Pratt Lecture Series is dedicated to facilitating the impact of research on practice at Ivy Street in order to improve our outcomes. John Pratt was a member of MAB Community Services Board of Directors, in addition to serving as the Associate Director of the Whitehead Institute for 25 years. John cared deeply about the work that MAB and Ivy Street do to help young people with disabilities develop the skills they need to transition into the lives that they want as adults. Suzanne Pratt played a significant role in launching and sustaining this lecture series and was a social worker, mother of 2, grandmother of 4, and loving wife to John. 2 years ago, for our Pratt lecture, we had the honor of welcoming Dr. Temple Grandin, who helped us take a closer look at the way we support our young people in their paths towards career development. And she also was able to share her knowledge and experience with many of our families. Tonight, we are absolutely thrilled to welcome Lydia X.Z. Brown, whose work aligns deeply with our values at Ivy Street. Before we get to our lecture, we are going to take a moment to welcome Kate Garrity, who is our Chief Learning Officer. Kate will be awarding our Suzanne and John Pratt Teaching Fellowship Award this evening.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Brooke. I'm excited to be standing here tonight to award the Suzanne and John Pratt Teaching Fellowship Award to a very worthy recipient. This person we recognize today has been an employee of Ivy Street since 2021. They have grown in their time here and have almost done it all. They began on our residential team, moved to our educational team as a senior education counselor, and then most recently as a long-term substitute teacher in our classrooms. This person has shown both dedication to the school, attunement to our students, and an energy and motivation to do great work and always better themselves throughout their time at Ivy Street. We're excited to support their next step in attaining their master's degree in education with a licensure in special education. Please join me in congratulating our Teaching Fellowship recipient, Jazz Kermode, to the stage. And Jazz has decided very bravely to speak a few words.
Hi, I'm Jazz, like the music. I keep finding myself at a loss for words other than I'm just so lucky. And I'm lucky for this opportunity, but more I'm lucky to be in the classroom. I have learned so much from my students. I've learned so much in my time. And I only hope that I can impart just a wee bit of that knowledge to my students, just like they've done to me. And I think I'm just really grateful for them above all else. That's all.
Thank you. Now, please join me in welcoming Aiden Falk, who will share his Ivy Street experiences and introduce our Pratt lecturer, Lydia X.Z. Brown, to the stage.
Hello, my name is Aiden Falk. I'm a student at Ivy Street. One of my favorite things about Ivy Street and I've enjoyed is work with Danita Jones Menina, Nirma Geronimo, and one of my favorite things I've done at Ivy Street would have to be sports and prom. Last year, I met with one of my closest friends, Alice McGrath, and recently going with a new student, Jolie Lerner, and excited to go to prom with her this year. Page 2. It is my great pleasure to introduce Lydia X.Z. Brown, who will present the 2024 Suzanne Pratt Lecture. Lydia X.Z. Brown, they, them, their, themselves, or no pronouns, is a public writer, public speaker, educator, trainer, consultant, advocate for community organization, community builder, activist, scholar, and attorney. Their work focuses on addressing and ending impartial and state violence, turn disability people and actively engage with issues that insurge of disabilities, queerness, race, gender, class, and nation migration. Lydia leads the autistic people of color. They also hold a position at Georgetown University and American University, contributing to disability studies, women's and gender studios, and critical race, gender, and culture studies. In addition, Lydia serves as a director of party policy at the National Disability Institute 8. Please welcome to stage Lydia X.Z. Brown. Give a round of applause. Thank you.
Okay. I have been told that this should click to the next slide. It did. I tested it beforehand. All right. Welcome, and thank you very much for hosting me. As we begin this evening, I will open with an invitation and an invocation. The image that you see on screen is a photograph that shows a young South Asian woman who is lying barefoot in soft and gentle daylight on a bed of leaves beneath the trees. This is an image from a campaign called Meet to Sleep, which is a campaign to raise awareness about gender and sexual-based violence happening in India. But I choose to have this picture here to accompany my invitation to you, to use this space in whatever way each of you needs and desires. My work is grounded in a practice and commitment of disability justice. And disability justice reminds each and every one of us that all of our bodies and minds have needs, and all of our needs deserve to be met, whether or not you are presently disabled, and whether or not you will become disabled in the future. You have needs. And so at any time, please feel free to move about this space in whatever way works for your body and mind. I realized that that square is slightly recessed, and I almost fell over sideways a second ago, so I will avoid that square. It's happened. I once fell off a stage 6 feet down. Didn't look at the edge, didn't see it, went straight down. But we're fine. That hasn't happened tonight. There is no edge, so that probably won't occur. Use this space in the way that your body, mind most needs. If you would like to use an extra seat to leave your things, to lean on, please feel free to do that. If you would rather sit on the floor or pace around the room, you are welcome and invited to do that. You are welcome to come in and out as you need or prefer, to rock, spin, flap, jump, whatever it is that your body, mind needs to do in order to be able to inhabit this space as comfortably as possible. And if you are joining us online from home, I hope you're not still at the office. Please tell me you left. You are also welcome to join from a couch or the bed, or if you want to sit out and get drizzled on, I guess outside is technically an option. I invite you to make use of this space in the way that attends to your body-minded needs. This is also an invitation to you to take a moment to tune in, to listen, to pause, to what it is that your body-mind is telling you that it needs, craves, and desires. Have you carried into this space with you tonight your grief, sorrow, or mourning? Have you carried with you into this space tonight your anxieties and frustrations, your exhaustion and bone weariness? Have you carried with you into this space tonight? I'm avoiding that square. Have you brought here tonight your excitement, your gratitude, your joy, your eager anticipation, your secret desire for me to trip and fall over there? Have you brought with you tonight decades of loneliness, your angers, your frustrations, dashed and shattered dreams, the righteous indignation and fury of elders and ancestors? Have you brought with you tonight a sense that you didn't have enough to eat because you forgot to get enough cheese from out there? You didn't have enough to drink. There's still water, I'm pretty sure. You can go get it. What is it that your body-mind is telling you now that it needs? In what ways might your needs be able to be met? Through an adjustment, a change, a shift, through making a request of others around you, whether you are here in this room or you are at home. Let this be a reminder to us all that for those of us for whom right now in this space it is not possible, financially, emotionally, perhaps professionally, to ask for your needs to be met, that is not a reflection on your worth, that is not a value judgment, that you are unworthy, undeserving, that you do not deserve to exist, to inhabit the space, to be present. And let this also be a reminder that for those of you for whom you are in a place or space where you might ask for your needs to be met, that you are not wrong or burdensome or a troublemaker simply for asking for the care and the support that you need, that you are not the problem, that you are not broken, simply for having needs, one of the most basic of human things. And so I invite you in this moment of pause, this moment of grounding, to listen and tune in to what your body is telling you about what you need in this moment. To feel breath move in and out. To give yourself permission to exist in and expand in your body and not to simply push yourself down into the smallest possible version of yourself. Some people will close their eyes. It helps them focus and listen. But if you heard that and you're like, that's weird and awkward and I don't want to, then don't. But listen to your body. Tune in to your body. Join me in a moment as we take this grounding together. Thank you for joining with me in that pause, in that turn, in that tuning. I give that note to every group that I work with. I've given that invitation when I came to a room, showed up, and there were 2 people there, which was exactly as awkward as it sounds like. And another time when I showed up and wasn't told there were 5,000 people there, which was also exactly as awkward as it sounds like. Don't worry. Ivy Street prepared me much better. I knew what was happening. Thank you for that. It is a practice of disability justice to remind ourselves that each and every one of us is implicated, that disability justice is relevant for each of us, whether or not, as stated, you are presently disabled, whether or not that word resonates with you, whatever your comfort might be with that word at this time. Disability justice is relevant to us all because we're all inhabiting bodies and minds that are messy and leak and spill. We all inhabit bodies and minds that have needs and fluctuating capacities, physically, emotionally, cognitively. We all are in flux. Our bodies and minds are constantly changing. They are constantly growing and breaking down all at once. And so as we move to the second note before we move into the meat of tonight's talk, I also want to acknowledge that we do not all come to this space with the same experiences, with the same lineage or baggage or memory. The image on this screen is a silhouette of a person in a ponytail yelling into a bullhorn up at the words that say content warning. during part of our time this evening, I will make reference to some topics that might be heavier and darker, that relate to forms of discrimination and abuse. I will not be showing or playing any video, audio, or images that depict any acts of harm of any kind. I will not be providing any detailed graphic descriptions of any form of violence, but I will be describing in brief, non-graphic detail some experiences of trauma and violence. And so I believe and recognize often that when we enter these spaces, we're not describing things in a vacuum. We're not talking about issues abstractly that happen to some people over there and that we are all unaffected by. You are here because you have a personal connection to disability, neurodivergence, illness, or madness. You are here because you are a teacher, because you are a student, because you are a caregiver, a lover, a family member. You are here because you have been witness to or survivor of inequity or injustice in some form, whether or not you had the words to describe it as such then. And so if at any time you feel that you need to take a pause from this conversation, you can exit, I believe it was said that way, to the lobby and take a break and come back. If you are watching from home, you can hit the mute button and turn off my volume. I promise I won't know. There's literally no way for me to know about it. If you find at any time you no longer have the capacity to participate or engage, you are also welcome and invited to withdraw from this space. I believe that this event is being recorded, getting a nod, and so you could come back and return and watch the rest of it later if you find that you cannot participate or continue for the rest of this evening. I will not assume if I see someone slipping out and they don't come back that it means you hate me, but as I tell everyone, I have social anxiety. I know, really hard to tell as I'm standing here. So part of me will think that you hate me, but if I'm being honest, I already think that all of you hate me. My social anxiety is like, yeah, every single person in this room is just glancing at the clock, thinking, when is this person gonna stop talking? They should never be invited again. Worst speaker ever on the history of the planet. Which is my social anxiety talking. And we can tell it to go shut up and sit in a corner and think about what it's done. The corner's like out there in this curved room that has no real corners. Terrible metaphor. They say that autistic people don't understand metaphor. They're wrong. Like, so wrong. I do encourage you to attend to your needs. I encourage you to take care with yourself. And I encourage you to invite in discomfort, but also listen to distress. And I trust that we here in this learning community together have the emotional maturity and discernment to think through whether what we are feeling is discomfort because something might be new or challenging, or whether something is actively causing distress, resurfacing old trauma. And I believe and trust in each of you to make that determination for yourself. And I thank you for extending me the trust of creating, or really co-creating, this space with you tonight. Now, our conversation tonight is focused on disability justice, which is a term that in my experience is often new to many. And where it is heard, it's commonly misunderstood. Most frequently, I hear others invoke the phrase disability justice because they have perceived it to be the more up-to-date, progressive way of saying disability rights or disability inclusion, or just in general to signal, I care about disability in some way. But truth is, the phrase disability justice actually has specificity. It isn't simply a more updated way to say disability rights, but it is an entire framework. It's an entire philosophy and it's a social change movement, that it is at once deeply and intricately interrelated with the neurodiversity movement, and it is also apart from and more transformative than the historical neurodiversity movement often has been. But that word, too, is often deeply fraught. I'm sure that being here in this space, being connected to Ivy Street, that you've all heard some variation of the word neurodiversity at some point. Please nod or raise your hand to indicate yes. Okay, seeing some hands. You can all tell I'm a professor. Because I'm I need some kind of feedback here. But the word neurodiversity, too, is often poorly understood. And that's because it actually means more than one thing. And what definition someone is using isn't always spelled out. So to understand disability justice and why it is significant and how it is related to neurodiversity also requires us to take a step back and go to the foundations. What actually is neurodiversity? The image that is on this screen is a beautiful piece of artwork called Interdependence. It shows multiple hands in very deliberately varied skin tones that are each holding the globe. And wrapped around the globe, enveloping it, are blossoming vines, indicating growth, connection, and intricate, interwoven experiences. It is a very viscerally beautiful depiction of a metaphor for interdependence. Neurodiversity as a term means 5 things. Those are listed here, conveniently. And this is not the one that has a laser pointer, which is probably for the better, because if there were a laser pointer, you would have just lost me for the rest of the evening. First and foremost, neurodiversity is a descriptive reality. We all know, if only by experience and observation, that all people's brains are not the same. Some people are great at math, and some people are me. Some people are amazing at languages, and other people struggle with one. Some people have a great memory, and others do not. Some people are born with an aptitude for book learning, and others struggle within the confines of the school environment. Our brains are not the same, and they change over time. Some people recall everything they've ever heard, and other people develop cognitive disability with age, or after illness, or after injury. Our brains are not identical. This is part of human biological diversity to acknowledge this, where the word neurodiversity has its roots, when it was coined by Australian sociologist Judy Singer in 1980 as a shorthand for neurological diversity. It's a descriptive reality. Our brains are not identical, and our brains change. Secondly, neurodiversity refers to a set of values, it is a philosophy that takes into account that descriptive reality and says our brains are not the same, and that's okay. That's the core value of neurodiversity as a philosophy. Our brains are not the same, and that doesn't mean that some of us are inherently broken. It doesn't have to mean that some of us are wrong. It doesn't have to mean that some of us are a problem, individually, medically, or in society. It is okay that all brains are not the same. Thirdly, neurodiversity is a social movement. This is where the term is most often used, at least understood, even if not quite perfectly, shall we say. Neurodiversity as a social movement came into being between the early 1990s and onward, and was pioneered largely within the autistic community by such early leaders as Cal Montgomery and Mel Baggs and Laura Tasonchik and Jim Sinclair, among many, many others. As a social movement, neurodiversity takes this value that all of our brains are not the same, and that is okay. It's not inherently a problem. And it says we should do something about that. If all of our brains are not identical, this is not inherently a problem or a bad thing, but society does treat some of us as a problem or as a burden or as an issue to be managed or solved or disappeared, then we should change society. Whether that is through changing how we do education, changing how we approach mental health care, for example, or changing what our laws say, or just changing how we treat people. We should do something about that. 4, neurodiversity is politically and culturally specific. The neurodiversity set of values and the neurodiversity social change movement can only exist within and in opposition to a belief that there is such a thing as a normal or typical human brain. If that belief does not exist, and certainly if that belief is rejected, then there is not a need for the neurodiversity movement. But clearly, in our society, there is a great need for this movement. You can just look at some statistics to figure out why that might be true. There was a study done in Europe, published within the last 10 years, that posited that autistic people are one of a handful of demographic groups for whom, with every subsequent level of educational attainment, our employment rate drops. So to spell that out a little more bluntly, an autistic person who never even got a high school diploma or GED is more likely to be employed than an autistic person who has a postgraduate degree. And we can pick apart a few slides later why that might be the case. There are many contributing factors, but don't get me started now or we'll never make it past this slide. But this is one statistic that points to the prevailing belief that there is such a thing as having a wrong brain, a broken brain, a disordered, diseased, or defective brain. And that therefore, the neurodiversity movement as a social change movement becomes a possibility in response to that prevailing belief. Lastly, neurodiversity as a movement, as a philosophy, can be and has been deeply interconnected with disability cultural movements and with MAD resistance. That word MAD, too, has a contested history. It is one that at once invokes the age of mass institutionalization of people who were deemed insane, incompetent, invalid. And it is also one that has been rooted in legacies of activism, of cultural creation, and community building. And the neurodiversity movement, while rooted early in autistic activism, has always been about creating and expanding ideas about how to support and care for and make access for all kinds of minds, for all ways of thinking and sensing and learning and communicating. And it is not just about the people who have the exact same disabilities as me, but it is about all of us who, within the social context where we are taught that there's one kind of normal brain, that there is one kind of normal person, we are deemed disordered, wrong, different, and that a moral judgment is placed on us for having that designation. Neurodiversity and disability justice, too, share many core values and beliefs. Disability justice as a social change movement began between 2005 and 2006. It was created by a coalition of disabled people, many of whom were queer or trans, that is part of the LGBTQ community, and or many of whom were people of color. Many were Black and brown. That's just a little under 20 years ago. And so for almost all of us in the room, that was within living memory, unless I'm drastically wrong about all your ages. And you're all secretly 18 or younger. Maybe you are. Neurodiversity came into being as a movement beginning in the early 90s. And so that was just over 30 years ago. And that was the moment where I paused thinking, did I do that math right? I did do that math right. Remember what I said about math? There's people that are good at math, and then there's me. And as an Asian autistic person, I just broke 2 stereotypes at once. Congratulations, I should get an award for that. Neurodiversity as a movement began about 30 years ago. Disability justice has been around for just under 20 years. A core foundational belief in both social change movements is there is not a wrong way to have a body or mind. And for those following along at home, that's what my pin says. It says there's no wrong way to have a body. These come from Glenn Marla, who is also an activist for social change, who I don't know, and I am not being paid to say this, but they sell these pins. So Glenn, there's some free publicity for you and your pins. There's no wrong way to have a body or mind. And just as foundational and related is the belief that all people need and deserve care and access. What our needs are change over the course of our lifetime. They change from one context to another. They change as we are born, as we begin school, as we enter adulthood, as we age, and as we near death. We need and deserve care and access. One of the problems of the society that we live in is that some needs are deliberately made invisible so that we don't realize they are needs. The needs of people who are treated as normal, healthy, e.g. neurotypical, not disabled, are made as if they don't exist at all. And the needs of those of us who are disabled in some way are made hyper-visible. And then we are blamed, guilted, and punished for having those needs. People may tell me sometimes, for instance, that, well, you know, people who are really disabled, which we assume you're not because you can use mouth words, just like a lot of people can use mouth words and doesn't necessarily mean that they are or not disabled. Well, we assume you're not disabled because you can use mouth words, and some of them are big. You had to look in a thesaurus to find out what they meant. And people who are really disabled can't live independently and will never be able to live independently. And then I ask us all to consider who lives independently. Even if you do not have a disability, if you've ever raised a child, I guarantee you relied on your relatives, your neighbors, people from your synagogue or church to take care of your kids at some point. And if you didn't, you're lying. Who hasn't had other people cook for them, even if it was only because you just got back home from the hospital, or a close relative died, or you came back from a traumatizing experience and you told your community about it? How many of you have been greeted with a casserole train? You're in New England. That has to be a bunch of you. I'm seeing a couple hands, right? You're greeted with the casserole train. But then thinking a little more materially, how many of you are clothed right now? That should be all of you. And how many of you made all your clothes? And even if you have made some of your clothes, which, by the way, if you have, firstly, I'm very impressed, and secondly, I want to learn your secrets. I bet that you did not cut, weave, and dye all the cloth yourself. And if you did, then you're probably lying. Unless that's actually your full-time job. Maybe it is. Shouldn't assume. How many of you have a phone with you? Probably all of you. Did you manufacture it? Did you mine the silicon that went into the chip that was in your phone? Now we're really getting deep. You live somewhere. Did you do your own electrical work? Please tell me no, because that's a fire hazard. Personal experience, not from me, from a friend. I've paid someone to do that. We do not live independently, just as human beings. None of us do. And what level of support or dependence we have changes, depending on context, depending on age, depending on situation, right? But we all are dependent and we all require support. But it is only those of us who are labeled as disabled for whom those needs are treated as a problem, as evidence that we're irresponsible, that we're lazy, that we are a drain on society. Not an exaggeration. This is the rhetoric with which we are met. So a core principle is that all people actually have needs. We are all dependent. We all have needs, and we all deserve care, and we deserve access. The third foundational principle in how we think about this question of disability, this word I keep using, that I guarantee everyone in this room has a different relationship with. Some of you are like, yep, that is my word, these are my people. And some of you are sitting there thinking, I don't know how I feel about this word disability. I don't know if I feel comfortable with this word disability. I'm not sure I like this word. We are taught to believe very negative ideas about disability, including at the baseline that whatever we put into the category of disability is bad, undesirable, a problem. And both neurodiversity and disability justice help us to understand that disability itself is natural and normal. That is the language in the preamble to the Americans with Disabilities Act. Disability is a natural part of the human experience. That was a direct quote. And disability is both a cause and a consequence of oppression. Both are true. Disability is a natural and normal part of the human experience. Some of us are born disabled. Some of us acquire or develop disabilities. It can happen because of genetic accident. It can happen because of environmental exposure. It can happen because of acts of violence. It can happen because of neglect or deprivation. It can happen because of disease, illness, injury, or age. Disability is a natural and normal part of the human experience, and it is both a cause and a consequence of oppression. It is a cause that fuels into beliefs we hold about what kinds of people are not just normal, but desirable and ideal, and what kinds of people are expendable and disposable. What kinds of people, in other words, we should throw out and cease to acknowledge or care about. Neurodiversity and disability justice do not posit either that disability is inherently a horrible tragedy, which it isn't necessarily, nor that all experiences of disability are happy sunshine and rainbows, which they aren't often. I will tell you that it was not fun, for example, that last summer I was kicked out of physical therapy by my insurance company after a knee injury because, as the denial letter said, quoting, "You are still experiencing physical pain. Therefore, physical therapy is no longer medically necessary." Unquote. And my autistic brain broke a little bit at that. Like, what do you mean not medically necessary? I don't understand this. So disability is not always an experience of happy sunshine and rainbows. Sometimes it is an experience of extreme rage while you're on hold for 4 hours and 49 minutes and then transfer to somebody else who then puts you on hold for another 2 hours and 13 minutes. And then they answer again, and then you are abruptly disconnected and hung up upon. And then you try to call back the same number and you are told, Our office is currently closed. Please call during normal business hours, which are Monday to Friday, at 5 a.m. until 3 p.m. Slightly exaggerated version of the true story. Slightly. I guarantee that many of you have had those same experiences of rage, of frustration, of feeling inept and helpless against a system that is designed to trap you and to make you feel small and insignificant and like you are the problem just because you're like, can it hurt less? Which should be simple. Can it hurt less? For those of you who don't know, 2 years ago, I ran for state legislature. My campaign slogan was, "We deserve better." But I feel like when I run again in 2 years, it should also be, "Can it hurt less?" For all of us. Everybody should be able to get behind that. Except, of course, the people who don't see me as human to begin with. But then I don't know what to tell them. And they're probably not here. The fourth way in which neurodiversity and disability justice operate together is to remind us that needing care and support, which all of us do in varying ways and in ways that change over time, does not equate to needing to be cured, let alone to needing to be prevented or eliminated. Needing care or support does not mean that we need to be cured. And I will add to that, it does not necessarily mean that we need to be cured. Individual people can want whatever they would like with their bodies and minds. Individual people might very much desire to be cured of what they experience as ailing them. But this value statement rejects the idea that we should assume as a default that all disabled people always should be cured of being disabled, that this is desirable and in fact assumed to be the best outcome for all disabled people with every kind of disability at all times. Because the reality is that I, as someone who has multiple disabilities, don't need my disabilities to go away most of the time, but I would like people to stop treating me like shit, which is the technical term for unlawful discrimination and hostile environment and constructive termination, for example. I am also a lawyer, so see me afterward if you are seeking a legal referral. I would like, for example, for an insurance company to actually pay for things like meds that I need. I would like, for example, for potential employers not to start talking to me in a baby voice like I'm 5 years old when they realize that I'm autistic. I would like, for example, for people to see me as somebody who is capable of making decisions about and having opinions over my own life, instead of constantly asking me, in my 30s, where are your parents? Should you be out by yourself? I'm in my 30s. Are any of you in your 30s and older being asked all the time, where are your parents, and should you be out by yourself? If you're not disabled, probably not. And if you are being asked that, I have some questions about the people you're around. I would like for people to assume that I am a person who deserves to be able to make decisions about my finances, where I live, my health care, who I love, who I spend time with, and where I go. I don't need to suddenly not be autistic. And if I were somehow magically not autistic anymore, I wouldn't be me. I would be some other person that has my legal name, but is not me. But there are other experiences of disability that I have that, like many disabled people, I don't want at all. Gastrointestinal distress and lactose intolerance, the worst. Not fun. There was so much cheese out there, I ate a bunch of it. I have a lapel pin I'm not wearing that says lactose intolerant in denial. And I know I'm not the only one because a bunch of you laughed at that. So some of you are guilty as charged, not just me. I don't want that experience, actually. And even that phrase, too, calls to mind what I had on the previous slide, that neurodiversity is politically and culturally specific. Most of the world is lactose intolerant, but most white people of European descent can digest lactose. It is people of the global majority, most Asians, most people of African descent, Black and other African descent people, Latina and indigenous peoples globally, whose bodies do not produce lactase. And so there is a value judgment embedded into the medicalization of whose bodies can naturally digest dairy and whose bodies cannot. And I wish my body could digest dairy without inconvenient problems. I may or may not later regret the amount of cheese I ate. But my taste buds did not. Last, neurodiversity and disability justice both push a value of harm reduction and radical transformation. We know that the way things are in the world now is not working. We know that many more autistic people and people with other intellectual and developmental disabilities many more do not complete high school or transition to post-secondary education than those who, like me, are privileged enough to have gone on and gotten a higher degree. We know that many more people who are disabled experience poverty than those who are not disabled. The poverty rate is about twice that for disabled people as it is for non-disabled people, which also mirrors the unemployment rates. These are not the disaggregated numbers that break it down by race and gender or by type of disability or age. This is just the overall big picture bird's eye view of the numbers. We are twice as likely across the board as disabled people to be unemployed or poor as people who are not disabled. People who have intellectual and developmental disabilities are 7 times more likely to be targeted for sexual violence than people who don't have a disability. Students with disabilities who are school age, that is defined in US law as up to the age of 22, are disproportionately likely to be suspended, whether in or out of school suspension, to be expelled, or to be arrested in school. And those numbers increase astronomically for students with disabilities that are also categorized as Black and or Hispanic, which is the word used in the Department of Education's Civil Rights Data Collection Report. These are just a few of the realities that help to explain where we are. We live in a country where it remains 100% legal to pay disabled people sub-minimum wage under Section 14C of the Fair Labor Standards Act. We live in a country where a 1927 Supreme Court decision, Buck v. Bell, that upheld the use of forcible sterilization to prevent the wrong kind of people from being born, that decision has never been overturned. And in most states, it is still legal for family court and child welfare agencies to discriminate against parents who have disabilities solely on the basis of disability status, even in the absence of a specific finding of actual abuse or neglect of a child. We live, at least you all live, I've left Massachusetts, you all live in a state that has the only institution in the country known to subject disabled people to painful electric shock as a punishment just down the road in Canton, right off the highway. And that is not only legal, it is actually signed off on by a judge in the Bristol County Probate and Family Court each time it happens. And that institution has been condemned twice by the United Nations, by the way. Just specifically calling out the United States over this one institution on the South Shore. Great claim to fame. Faneuil Hall is a better claim to fame. Although I heard that a bunch of the restaurants I used to eat at got ripped out and closed. So, crying in autism over here at the change I didn't want. So we know that the way things are is not working. Otherwise, we would not be contending with these extreme realities of injustice, of inequity, of disabled people being forced out of school and pathways to work, disabled people being subjected to abusive forms of treatment and legal control, disabled people having outcomes that are poor across the board, and only a few of us being able to say we were success stories, but success in what? In surviving? Because our success is always predicated on keeping things the way they are, and I don't want that, actually. I don't want to be successful in a system that says for you to succeed, many more must fail. That for you to succeed, many more must be slated as so unworthy that they can be written off. And I could have been written off in so many different ways, in so many different places. I went to law school right around here, around the corner from where we are, probably. Didn't check the T station, don't know which one that is. Probably close to here. And I remember when I disclosed my disabilities to the disability support liaison, I was told, well, based on the kind of disabilities you have, I'm not really sure that I can see you succeeding in law school and finishing this program. And you might want to consider whether you should be here. I was essentially told that my best course of action might be to drop out, just because I'm disabled and asked for my basic access needs to be maybe met. I will tell you, I graduated and they will pry that degree out of my cold, dead hands. And I did not earn it because of the help of people who were committed to see me fail. I earned that degree despite low expectations and a presumption of incompetence. I earned that degree despite a professor who believed that I literally couldn't work with clients, despite a professor who believed that I was so unprofessional for existing, just literally existing, that I should be removed from the program. I completed that degree despite classmates deciding that they should speak to me like I was 5 years old. This was the voice they used to talk to me, which is not a voice that I recommend any of you should ever use to talk to me unless you I don't actually wish to be arrested and charged with assault. However, the fantasy of why would you say that is very appealing. We know that this system isn't working even for those who seem to succeed despite its best efforts. And so neurodiversity and disability justice understand that we need to deal with things as they are. We need to put a stop to the most immediate harms, to the most immediate inequities and injustices. This is what I'm calling here, in the tradition of many decades of activism, a harm reduction approach. We should change the law, fight to resurrect the bill that was just killed in committee here on Beacon Hill that would have outlawed the electric shocks. We should change the law to repeal Section 14C sub-minimum wage. We should perhaps do something to stop funding police departments that are responsible for killing such large numbers of disabled people. According to some estimates, anywhere between 50 to 80% of people killed by police are disabled. And those who are Black or Native and Indigenous and also have a disability are that much more likely to be targeted by that form of violence. We should do something about the fact that our US Department of Justice itself admits that 85% of youth in prison qualify for special education. That's according to the Department of Justice. Not outside researchers, not activists. The Department of Justice admits 85% of youth in prison qualify for special ed. This is, of course, not an exact proxy for how many might be disabled, because some disabled people are found not to qualify for services, and some people might be marked as qualifying for special education for reasons other than what we would understand as a disability. But it's a pretty close proxy, if not an exact one, and a horrifying one. You should be horrified by this statistic. So we need to do something about that. We need to leverage every possible way of changing our laws and policies, every possible relationship with a funder, with a school, with a state agency, with a local school board, to do something about these stark realities. And we must recognize that none of that work is sufficient. It is necessary, but it is not sufficient. Why? A lot of people will say, well, Lydia, you're a lawyer. What do you mean that the work of law isn't sufficient? Why else would you have become a lawyer? Well, partially I became a lawyer despite that professor. But I also became a lawyer because I recognized that law is but one lever of change of many. We need to change our laws and policies, and we need to move far beyond law and policy. The Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law in July 1990. That was almost a quarter of a century ago, and I know that math is right. No, wait, it was more than a quarter of a century ago. That math was wrong. You know what? We know that there are two kinds of people, the ones that are good at math and me. It was more than 30 years ago, almost 35 years ago. That's the correct number there. I should stop trying to say numbers because I will keep doing it wrong. But you know what? If it amuses you, great. Lawyers don't need to know math. Unless they're in solo practice and they're in charge of all their billing and taxes, then I guess they need to know math. And that's why I don't do that. That's why I'm here. So the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law before some of you were born, but within living memory of many of you. It was signed into law in July 1990, and the idea, as it was the first nationally applicable disability civil rights law that extended into the public and private spheres, not just to government agencies, that it would change the landscape for disabled people. And guess what? It did. Thanks to the ADA, it is now much more possible for many disabled people, regardless of type of disability, to access things like a movie theater, or the school they go to, or City Hall somewhere, or virtually anywhere else they would like to be. And the ADA is not consistently followed or enforced. Think about all of the restaurants that you could walk to from this building, and how many of them have narrow entryways and stairs leading inside. Think about the last time you went to a movie theater and actually saw an option for closed captioning for any of the films that were being shown. Think about your experience now or in the recent or maybe not so recent past when you were in school, when you were in college, when you had a job, and about how and to what extent disabled people were actually supported or accommodated. Think about those numbers that I gave you, the ones that were correct, not the years. Think about those statistics about the levels of violence and discrimination and poverty that disabled people experience. The ADA was signed into law more than 30 years ago, and yet disabled people are disproportionately poor, targeted for sexual, financial, and other kinds of abuse, pushed out of school, kept out of the workforce, and set up to fail, even though we have the ADA. The neurodiversity and disability justice movements each help remind us that while we need the advocacy for harm reduction to address the way things are now, the problems that face us now, we also need radical transformation. Because you can't just pass a law and change people's attitudes. The ADA is not the only disability civil rights law we've passed. Before the ADA, in 1973, Congress signed into law the Rehabilitation Act, which was the actual first disability civil rights law, but it only applied to federal agencies and federally funded programs, services, and activities. Same year, Congress passed what was then called the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, thankfully later renamed to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, guaranteeing the right to a free and appropriate public education in the least restricted environment. Side note, I did practice special ed law for a year, and I had a school administrator act toward me as if I had no idea what an IEP was or what a least restricted environment was, and said to me, "Have you even heard of an IEP?" And I was like, "I'm the lawyer representing this family and this student. Yes, I know what an IEP is. Also, I had one. I know what an IEP is." Talk about presumption of incompetence. We've had laws passed since 1973, before the ADA, the 1984 Developmental Disabilities Assistance and Bill of Rights Act, that established the beginnings of what we now know as the Developmental Disabilities Network of our DD councils, our protection and advocacy agencies. The one here is the Disability Law Center, which last I checked was still at 9.5 Beacon Street, unless they moved, and I don't know about that, which I guess there's no reason I would know about that. It also helped fund the networks of university centers on excellence in developmental disabilities, which we also have here at UMass Boston. The Institute for Community Inclusion is the federally funded USEN. And we've had laws passed since 1990. Laws been created through the courts and through acts of Congress. In 2008, Congress passed the ADA Amendments Act to strengthen the ADA, to make sure that people with disabilities have even greater protection under law. There's the Federal Air Carrier Access Act. I could keep going for a long list of laws. You're not here for that. You can look up on Wikipedia disability rights laws and find a list that is probably accurate. The point is, we've passed a lot of laws, we've made a lot of progress, and yet, we continue to face profound injustice. We need to transform societal and cultural values and attitudes, because if we don't do that, then we're not going to change materially the conditions as to why we face so much injustice. We'll keep creating a need for more and more laws that aren't really doing anything to change attitudes or beliefs. Laws only change compliance requirements. They don't necessarily change values. And in fact, I would argue they rarely, if ever, change values. The problem of disability discrimination, which we often call ableism, a form of oppression, runs deep and wide. It implicates and affects every single one of us, whether we know it or not. The photograph on this screen shows a young Southeast Asian person with short black hair. Their name is Mimi Kook. They are my friend. They just published a book that was out this week. Thought it would be out earlier, and you could all be told to read it. And I was wrong. It came out like yesterday. But you should read it. I'm not being paid to say that. I don't have a copy yet. I have to buy it. The quote says, "We live and work in a machine that requires us to be well, that does not allow us to be unwell, that punishes us for being unwell, and that asks us to punish others for being unwell in order to prove that we are well." This is a very clear reference to the realities that many of us live with, that we are expected, whether you are currently disabled or not, to prove over and over again that we're normal, functional, healthy, whole, able, that we are productive, that we are contributing, that we are sufficiently capable. We are all expected at all times to have to prove, I am worthy of being treated like a human. I am worthy of being treated as a person. I'm intelligent enough, I'm strong enough, I look good enough. I say that facetiously, but I mean that, and you all know that on some level. That we are judged by how attractive we are, by how intelligent we can appear to be, by how close we can approximate the arbitrarily determined standards of normal, neurotypical, able-bodied, well. And those of us who refuse, fail, or are unable to meet those standards are taught we are wrong, we are the problem. And we are taught to externalize that too. At the Willowbrook State School, a notorious state-run institution for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities that has long since been closed, researchers interviewed some of the long-term residents who had a wide range of intellectual and developmental disabilities. And one resident is quoted in one of these history books as having said that he was proud that he had progressed enough that he was considered a high-grade moron. This is when the word moron was a diagnostic term. It was considered a medical label. Today it's an insult. And now you know why, if you didn't know that. He was proud to have been considered a high-grade moron so that he did not have to live in the other part of the institution where the low-grade morons lived. This is a deep-seated belief that all of us are taught, even and especially those of us who know that we are disabled, that our worth is only able to be measured by how much we can distance ourselves from the people in the wrong category. I may be autistic, but at least I'm not mentally ill, which, by the way, is probably a lie for most autistic people. We all have some level of depression and post-traumatic response. Or here I am autistic, but at least I don't have an intellectual disability. Or I'm autistic, but I'm able to communicate verbally. But I've also heard this from people with every other kind of disability. Yes, I'm blind, but I don't like to think of myself as disabled because I'm able to do things, unlike some other people who can't do things. Or I'm in a wheelchair, sure, but my mind works just fine. Not realizing that you just said that to me, a person who has been told that I am mentally defective. You are telling me that your right to be treated as a person, as a human, depends upon distancing yourself from some other person who doesn't count as human. But this also extends outside and beyond disability communities. It is in how we work. We are taught we have to prove we are extremely productive on top of everything, not affected by anything, such as, a global pandemic and mass death and mass disabling event in which more than 1 million people have died that we know of. That we are not affected by things like, for example, you sharing that your mother is now experiencing dementia. That we're supposed to move through the world like everything is fine and not have bodily, mental, or emotional needs. Just be professional and chipper and functional. And if we fail to do that, you're marked as the problem. This quote is a reminder to us of just how deeply ableism runs. It runs within relationships, within workplaces, within schools, among those of us who are disabled. And it also comes out in other social change movements. There's a long history, for example, in the LGBTQ movement of pushing an advocacy agenda that says being queer or trans is not a mental illness. There's nothing wrong with us. And while both parts of that statement, sure, I can agree with as someone who is queer and trans and also neurodivergent, the underlying message of that campaign is we should be treated as humans and we should have access to rights because we're not in that category. And the people who are accurately labeled as mentally ill, which is not us, by the way, the people who are accurately labeled as mentally ill are a danger to society. They are unstable. They don't know what's best for them. They should be subjected to greater medical and perhaps police surveillance. They should have their rights restricted, and they should be looked upon with at least some level of suspicion because they're probably unstable in some way. But don't lump us in with that group. We should be respected and have rights because we're not part of that group. Those people over there. And this type of ableist disavowal helps no one, even though it's all pervasive. Everywhere from the Willowbrook State School to the LGBTQ equal rights movement to the autistic community now. We are all taught that we have to keep outdoing each other and proving that we count as people, that we have to outdo each other and proving how normal and human we are, and that we do that by appealing to being seen as sufficiently productive and intelligent, capable and stable, sufficiently acceptable, sufficiently respectable. And don't get me wrong, if you're thinking, I don't think I've ever thought that, I promise we all have. I have. We are all taught to think this way. That, well, of course I would never say someone else doesn't deserve human rights, but I still don't want to be associated with that kind of person. That's the most insidious version of this, of all. Of course I believe everyone deserves rights. Of course I believe everyone should be supported. Of course I believe everyone should be able to live in the world and exist in their bodies. I just really don't want people to think that I am one of them. That is the most insidious version of this. So what is ableism? I keep using this word. I've referenced it a few times. I have this definitional slide here to help give the visual for you. At its core, most foundationally, ableism is a system of values and beliefs. It's a system of values and beliefs about bodies and minds that tells us which kinds of bodies and minds are normal and which kinds are deviant, and therefore which kinds of bodies and minds are desirable and which must be avoided, managed, or eliminated at all costs. As a system of values and beliefs, ableism teaches us who gets to not just count as a person or have their personhood assumed, but it also teaches us what kind of people we believe we should bring into the world. What kinds of people should have children? What kinds of children should be born? What kinds of people we want in the future? Ableism teaches us what we should do about the people who live here now. It tells us who to treat as a problem and who to afford respect and dignity to. Ableism operates in two very important ways. It is a system of values and beliefs that targets for harm those of us who actually are or are treated as disabled, even if we don't use that word. If you are or are perceived as disabled, you are the target of ableism, the person that ableism says doesn't count as human, should not be included, perhaps should be controlled, should be prevented from existing in the future. But even if you are not disabled, you are affected by ableism. You are affected by the expectation, the requirement to be well, to be functional, to prove over and over again how productive you are in order for your life to be seen as meaningful or worthy. In other words, ableism is about disability discrimination and oppression. And, not but, and ableism has ripple effects that harm us all. Ableism has ripple effects that harm us all. As fellow disability justice advocate Talila Lewis says, quote, "You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism," unquote. You don't have to be disabled to be negatively affected by the expectation to keep working through pain, through trauma, through loss, through hardship. You don't have to be disabled in order to be affected by the expectation to perform happiness, wellness, or functionality through the worst of times and the worst of experiences. The other way to understand ableism is this word I've kept using as well tonight, and that's this word oppression. That ableism is not just about bad ideas, prejudice, bias, or stereotypes, but it is about values and beliefs that are imbued with power. That is, values and beliefs that are not just held by some people, or randomly by individuals, but that are embedded into the bedrock of our economic system, of our legal system, of the cultural values that we hold about everything from work ethic to acceptable familial structures to how we should teach students in school. Ableism is a system of power relations and power differences, where some people, whoever, and this is always a moving goalpost. So when I say some people, I mean this moves. This definition is fluid, and it's based on what is politically convenient. Some people who are deemed as healthy and normal and whole and well and functional and stable and strong and intelligent and beautiful. Those people are afforded economic, political, cultural, and social power at the expense of people whose bodies and brains are written off as broken, disordered, weak, crazy, unstable, dumb, or ugly. Those people who are treated as normal are granted power societally because of that designation. And that power comes at the expense of those who are deemed deviant, unstable, or wrong. This is most often and most obviously a designation that is attached to ideas about disability. But ableism spills out, and that's what the last sentence on this slide is referencing. Ableism is both necessary for and dependent upon every other form of oppression. And we need only think about the societal messages that we're told about other forms of difference or marginality to understand that. Sexism and patriarchal ideas will spin a narrative that women or anyone who is feminine are overly emotional, irrational, bad leaders, neurotic, or hysterical. These are all words and ideas that are deeply related to ideas about the brain, about certain kinds of brains. What are the narratives we are most often offered about homelessness or about poverty? That people who are homeless or poor are irresponsible, reckless, impulsive, stupid, uneducated, incapable of being educated, bad at money, impulsive, or irrational. These are all words that clearly convey ideas about a kind of brain. They're also words that are used in clinical diagnostic criteria for a wide range of types of neurodivergence. What are the narratives that have been given to us about the LGBTQ community? Narratives pushed under ideologies of racial superiority and white supremacy? Narratives pushed about all other forms of difference are often wrapped up in ideas about bodies and brains. What kinds of bodies and brains or characteristics of bodies and brains are treated as either normal or ideal and which are not. So ableism is about disability and it spills beyond disability. And to understand the necessity of disability justice requires us to grapple with just how pervasive ableism is and how ableism shows up in every part of our society, even down to what we are taught to think of and recognize as being a disability. We are not often afforded the opportunity, for instance, to think about disabilities like developmental disabilities caused by exposure to lead poisoning that is more common in impoverished Black communities, or the rate of cancer in Navajo youth in the Southwest United States, which is the group that has the highest rate of cancer of all youth in the country because of exposure to radioactive waste and nuclear mining operations and nuclear tests that are done in that part of the United States. We're not taught, for example, I am allergic to racism. We are not taught, for example, to think about disabilities like autoimmune conditions that are caused by prolonged exposure to rodent or cockroach infestation in poorly maintained public housing, or disabilities like trauma, which is itself disabling and a disability, common among survivors of gender-based violence, domestic violence, or family disownment, which are very common in the LGBTQ community. We're not taught to think of as disabilities those disabilities that are caused by police violence and brutality, both physical and mental. Disabilities that are caused by the effects of war, genocide, occupation, and militarization that maim, debilitate, and kill. We are not taught often to think of as disability, in other words, the experiences of disability that arise out of the conditions of exploitation, of other forms of discrimination and harm. But disability justice begins at its core with an acknowledgement that we are all affected by ableism, and ableism affects us each differently. And so, of course, the intervention of disability justice, which is built upon disability rights and neurodiversity and many other social change movements, is relevant for all of us. Disabled people experience many realities of inequity and injustice. We've talked about many of these: higher rates of homelessness, higher rates of profiling, higher rates of unemployment. And I can tell you stories about all of these, and that's not why we're here. We're here to think and ask, what can we do about this? What can we do about the fact that disability is overrepresented in many other marginalized communities, and that disabled people experience so many forms of compounded harm and discrimination? And how we are also treated inherently and inevitably as the source of the problem, even as we are deprived of the same rights and freedoms as others. Disability justice reminds us at its core that struggles for change, for justice, and for liberation are deeply interconnected. This is a picture of Audre Lorde, who is well known as a Black queer writer, scholar, and artist. She was also disabled in more ways than one. And she wrote about her experiences with disability and illness, but that part of our history is often erased, even in stories and conversations about radical history, about social justice, and about Audre Lorde in particular. The quote here from her says, "There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives." And we don't. Disability justice is a reminder to all of us that the work of challenging ableism and these very harmful ideas about what constitutes normal and how we should therefore treat those who are deemed abnormal is relevant to every community that experiences dispossession and disenfranchisement. Our struggles are profoundly connected. They're not the same. They're not interchangeable. We don't experience injustice the same way. And so liberation looks different for each of us too. Freedom looks different for each of us. The freedom for me to live authentically may not look the same as the freedom for someone else to live authentically. But they share in common the idea that we all deserve to live free of fear and with abundance, that we deserve care, and that what that care looks like might be highly individual and contextual, but that we each deserve it nonetheless. This is a photograph of Leela Watson, Gangaloo, who is an Indigenous Australian. The quote says, "If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." This is a message that, for me, is a constant reminder that each of us is caught up in what Martin Luther King Jr. called an inescapable network of mutuality. To achieve an end to the injustice perpetrated by sub-minimum wage payments to disabled people requires an end to all forms of labor injustice and exploitation, including the failure to provide for adequate funding to pay enough wages to care workers who provide care to aging people and elderly people and disabled people of all ages. It requires an end to The fact that most public school teachers are paid far below a living wage. That people experience wage disparities across their entire career deeply tied to race and gender. That people who are incarcerated are paid cents per hour for their work, if anything, and in several states are paid nothing at all. To address the injustice that's done at the Judge Rotenberg Center that electric shocks disabled people just down the road in Canton, Massachusetts, requires addressing the injustice of all forms of forced treatment, all forms of treatment of abuse that masquerades as treatment, used on all disabled people. Just because it is the only institution we know of that electric shocks people doesn't mean that closing it has ended all violence against other disabled people. All of our struggles are deeply tied up together, and creating communities and futures where we can all thrive and live safely and freely means addressing the interconnectedness of all injustice as well as all justice that we seek to engender. This is a list of the principles of disability justice. You can look this up on your own. If you Google 10 principles of disability justice, you will get a free 2.5-page PDF that explains these principles. You don't need a picture, you can take it. If you don't need it, you can Google it. You will get a free 2.5-page PDF. It's only 2.5 pages long. And it will tell you these principles and what they mean for disabled people. But the one for me that is most important on this slide is collective liberation. Again, this recognition of that inescapable network of mutuality. We don't get free, we don't get safe, we don't get care unless and until we work to make a world possible where all of us can receive care. Unless we work to make a world possible where all of us can be valued for who and what we are, where all of us can be supported even as we might struggle with pain, with distress, with new experiences of trauma, with changes in our body and mind capacity, that we are still able to receive care in abundance, each of us, because we can't go it alone. We are interdependent, and that interdependence is not a failing or a weakness or a flaw. That interdependence is our path forward. That interdependence is the necessary condition for a world in which we embrace disability justice work. This is the last slide, I promise. It says disability liberation on the side, and there are 5 principles in my work as to what it means to translate this idea of disability justice and disability liberation into our lives. And that is first, the theme I've been repeating all night about the importance of care and access. A disability liberated future is one in which we are all able to receive care, one in which we all have access, and one that understands that care and access are not about compliance, and they're not about charity, they're about justice. Care is an act of justice. Access is a practice of justice. Relationships, because we don't do this work as individuals. We don't do justice work by ourselves. We don't do justice work in isolation. You can't take care of people by yourself, and you can't receive care by yourself either. And we can't do access alone. We have a team of 4 interpreters working here tonight to make communication possible for those who will not understand my spoken English. And in turn, to make it possible for those who communicate using a manual language to be able to be understood by those of us who are signing impaired. Care and access happen in relationship. They require interdependence, and they require simultaneously changed policies, because if the policies aren't working, then we should change them, and transformed systems, because simply changing the policies doesn't mean we've changed the underlying systems of how things are. We should change how schools treat students. We should change policies that favor abusive therapies over non-abusive ones, like applied behavior analysis, for example, long-rooted in compliance-based training. And we should perhaps change the way we do school, away from a model that assumes the purpose of school is to train people to conform to one model of success or adulthood or however it's being defined now, and think, what is the purpose of education? How could education transform? How can education help materialize the conditions of justice? How can education help those who are teaching and those who are learning make new worlds? And how can we, in thinking about liberation, also imagine what is possible now? This is not abstract. Maybe the word technically is, but it's not supposed to be an abstract set of concepts. This is an invitation to each of you in this room or on Zoom, wherever you're watching this. I actually don't know if it's Zoom. It's an invitation to each of you who are here now to consider how you can make present and possible some taste of justice. The world to come only comes as we make it, dream it, and build it. I invite you to commit to making a disability-liberated future possible. Thank you. And if you email that address, it will go to me, but your email could disappear into the black pit of ADHD. So let me know in the subject line if it's time sensitive or requires a response.
Is there any place or any country that's getting it more right than we are?
Betsy's question was, is there any place or country that's getting it more right than we are? And I will say to that, depends on who you ask. For example, there are some people who will say that the UK's national health system is an improvement over ours. And there are other people who live in the UK who will say they are being treated like crap, the scientific term. There are people who will say that there are cultural practices within and beyond the borders of what is currently known as the United States that value neurodivergence and disability, or what we would understand as neurodivergence and disability in ways that perhaps we do not. And at the same time, many of the same problems persist, but in culturally specific ways. There's an expose done in the last 10 years about chaining people with mental illnesses in Serbian institutions, and another one about the same thing happening in the country of India. And that has also happened here in the United States. There was a news story published in the last 10 years about South Koreans with disabilities being forced into enslavement. And that also was covered, and it's happening at a turkey plant in Illinois. And there was a book published that came out of it, The Boys in the Bunkhouse, won a bunch of awards, as I think a Pulitzer or something, that happened here in the United States. So I would not say confidently that there's some country that's just better than us, or that we are uniquely good or uniquely bad. There are ways in which politically and culturally the US has done really well, and ways in which we are doing awfully, and it's very bad. Like the scientific and legal term, it's bad, right? So, but I will tell you, if you are interested in what's happening globally, there are many networks of what are called disabled people's organizations working in multiple countries. I've got friends and colleagues in Southeast Asia, in South America, in North and Central Africa, in the Swana region, many other places that are working to advance disability rights and disability justice. And you can find a lot of this work online too. A US-based organization that does significant advocacy work with international partners is Women Enabled International. And I strongly encourage folks to check out their work if you're not familiar with them. or the groups that are supported by the Disability Rights Fund, which is headquartered here in Boston, which supports activists and advocates with disabilities all around the globe who are seeking to improve policy and practice in their home countries. I believe there's time for a couple more questions, and I see 2 of them. Just so you all know, in the audience here, there's these bright lights shining on me that frankly kind of hurt a little bit, and I can only barely see you. So there were 2 hands I saw here, one from the person in the white or ivory colored sweater, and then the person behind them. So why don't you ask your question?
Hi, thank you for letting me speak today. My question is, within people with autism, do you think that we could be getting better funding for services through the government?
The question is, for people with autism, do you think we could be getting better funding for services through the government? And the answer is yes. In Massachusetts, this state became the very last one to eliminate a hard and bright line IQ requirement to receive services from the Department of Developmental Services here. And until that requirement was ended, which was within the last 15 years, I know that's right because I was here. Within the last 15 years, there was a huge gap between people who were eligible for services from Department of Mental Health and people eligible for services from DDS. And some of you know what I'm talking about. And for those of you that are like, oh no, I don't know about this, here was the problem. If someone had dual diagnoses, for example, a diagnosis of autism and a diagnosis of a mental health condition, let's say bipolar, according to state eligibility requirements, the developmental disability diagnosis is always considered primary. And the primary diagnosis determines which agency you are eligible for state-funded services from. So a person who is autistic and also has bipolar would be considered ineligible for Department of Mental Health services because their primary diagnosis is autism. But until the IQ requirement was changed with DDS, if that person's IQ was above 70 based on measurements that in themselves have a history of racism and ableism, that's a separate lecture, if their IQ was measured as above 70, even if it was measured as 71, literally 71, they would be ineligible for DDS services. So if you were autistic or had any other intellectual developmental disability and your IQ was 71 or higher, you were unable to get services from either DDS or DMH. When the eligibility criteria changed, DDS adopted a functional needs assessment. And so now, at least in theory, your eligibility for DDS services depends on whether you are determined to need support from that agency or whether you are considered to have a level of support needs that you do not require their services. That assessment is still deeply flawed and riddled with problems where a lot of people get left behind who would actually benefit from services. But because it still opened the door to huge numbers of autistic people now being eligible who weren't before, funding hasn't increased proportionally. So there isn't enough funding within the state, but there also isn't enough funding federally. As you all may know from the news, if you're remotely paying attention and just as panicked as I, because I work federally in disability and finance policy, Congress has now made it 5 months into the fiscal year without passing a budget. We're 5 months in, and we don't have a budget to fund the federal government until the end of the fiscal year, which is in only 7 months. You know, we're almost halfway through. But the budget deals that are on the table right now, like some of this was just announced yesterday, would increase some funding for programs that provide disability-related services, including to autistic people, but slash funding in other areas. However, even in the areas where the proposed budget deal would increase the dollars from 2023, it's not going to be enough. It is not on the table right now congressionally to appropriate enough funds to meet the needs of all people with disabilities who need services that they can probably only get through government agencies. So the short answer to your question, I see you standing there. The short answer to your question is yes, we need more funding. And if you're like, I want to do something about that, contact your members of Congress federally, but also contact your state legislature elected officials, your state representative and your state senator, and tell them to increase the top line dollar allocation for disability services. Because if they don't hear from you, they might assume, well, we're not hearing anything about this, so it must not be important, which is of course not true. But if they do hear from you, they might still ignore you, but at least they don't have the excuse of saying, no one told me this. Let's take away their excuses. Are you coming with the shepherd's cane?
I feel like I don't want to end this conversation, but for the sake of time,
There's coffee and
there
desserts.
is coffee and dessert, and I have more remarks.
You have more
I
remarks.
do, unlike you, amazingly, who could talk all that long without notes. That was
My students are very disturbed and impressed.
incredibly impressive and very stimulating, and we thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, really, it was amazing. And certainly, I hope that everyone enjoyed the program as much as I did. I have my notes, unlike Lydia. Learning is a lifelong process. Be like Ivy Street. Stay curious and committed to disability justice. Ivy Street Skills for Life and Turning 22 programs help our students into adulthood ready to achieve their greatest independence. Think about what Ivy Street and disability justice mean to you, your student, alumni, and to future generations. Please join me in donating to Ivy Street through a donation envelope or by scanning the QR code on the back of your program. We'd all like to thank Boston University and WBUR for hosting us at CitySpace tonight. Thank you to East Meets West Catering, our volunteers from the Boston University chapter of Delta Gamma, our program participants, and our guests. This concludes our program. Those of us still here, and sorry for the ones on Zoom, are welcome to enjoy coffee, tea, and dessert in the lobby. Thank you again, and hope everyone has a great night.